illusion of a capitalist system is that the people who work will get paid wages, and then they go buy the stuff that they just made. Slaves couldn't consume anything. They couldn't buy anything. Moreover, they weren't left to seek out those parts of the economy that they could best serve. They weren't allowed to seek out the best wages. The system, then, according to free market principles, underpinning slavery and unfree labor, didn't make any sense. It was inefficient. As Great Britain industrializes, they start turning out a whole lot of stuff that people already had. That's the thing about industrialization. You don't make new goods. You make stuff you already have. Blankets, underwear, that sort of stuff. First Industrial Revolution was all about clothing and things. And they made a whole lot of them. Their biggest problem was who to sell them to. Who's going to buy all of this stuff? And slaves were not going to be a market. All right? So, in large part, then, we can see that there is a shift in terms of the value placed upon the slave trade that goes on within the first country in Western Europe to undergo an industrial revolution. And it's not terribly surprising, therefore, that in the early part of the 19th century, the British Empire makes slave trade over the seas illegal. And not only does it make it illegal, it actually sends out its navy to start intercepting ships. And where they find ships that slaves are traveling upon, they capture those ships, bring those people who are on them that are participating in the slave trade to justice, and then return substantial numbers of slaves to the West African coast. And actually where they return them is a contemporary country called Sierra Leone in West Africa. Right, so in large part then, the decision to end the slave trade is based upon sort of economic principles and the logic of what would be a new Western European economy. Now, up until this point, or through this point, into the 19th century, the notion of a racial hierarchy was firmly embedded in a European understanding of itself. So, together with the Age of Empire and finding peoples in all other corners of the world, Western Europe did discover other people and other nations. But this made more and more firm in their minds the notion that their way of life was the best. And they thought that it was proved by the nature of their economy, the nature of their wealth, that they were the only people on ships seeing all of this. All right? In other words, instead of finding an enormous diversity of humanity and appreciating it in many different forms, instead what we find is that the thinking in Western Europe is one where they can appreciate differences, but they see those differences as more or less corresponding to hierarchies. And that hierarchy placed Western Europe, people of Western European descent, at the top, and Africans, people of African descent, at the bottom, and then many different groups of people slotted somewhere in between. And some of the greatest thinkers in Western Europe at the time firmly agreed with this. Immanuel Kant is a good example, firmly believed in the notion of a racial hierarchy, one that was easily charted. Maybe the most famous work of literature about empire and about the reason for empire is made by a British poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling. Right, this poem is called White Man's Burden, and it very much, for us, sort of pulls together what Western Europe understood its place in the world to be at this time. You see, they believed with every passing year that their place as sort of the superior people in the world was one that not only did they benefit from, but one that they were, that they were responsible for. In other words, they governed their colonies. They kept slaves. Their responsibility was to make certain that they would keep safe these people, that they would in some way teach them. In other words, if you were from South Asia or Southeast Asia or Central Africa, it didn't much matter. That you were governed by Western Europe was to your benefit, according to this view. In other words, Western Europeans had a burden, a responsibility to colonize and to run the world. And this is really Rudyard Kipling's view. Now, in actuality, the white man's burden, although it's an expression of Western European ideas about their role in the world at the time, it is really addressed primarily to the United States, which, again, as sort of an outgrowth of Western Europe, the United States was not always much of an imperial power. They were reluctant to colonize, themselves a former colony. And it was actually in a treaty for the United States to formally colonize the Philippines. That's how Rudyard Kipling thought of it. It also is oftentimes cited as the rationale for the last wave of the Age of Empire, which is European conquest and colonization of the African continent in the 19th century. This is just the first passage. And I chose black. I have no idea why I chose black. Not a great one. But I'll read it to you guys in case you can't see. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. It's the 19th century, so like ye's. Don't let it throw you. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new-caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This is one passage, and in fact there are about 7. And they all make the same point. I'd ask you to think about the last line. Your new caught. In other words, those people who you have conquered. Sullen peoples. Right? They are ungrateful for being conquered. Imagine that, right? Half devil and half child. In other words, part of them are evil. All right? Their views are wrong and debased. Part of them are to be viewed as being wholly wrong and apart from our understanding of morality. And part of them don't know any better. Right? That's the argument laid down. In fact, whether we're talking about Africa or South Asia or people in lowland South America, they're all ignorant and evil and don't realize it. And therefore it's our responsibility, so goes the argument, for Western Europeans to conquer them, to teach them the error of their ways, and to look over them. Now the poem goes on to argue that these people will be a burden and that they will be ungrateful for being conquered and told what to do. And yet, so the argument goes, Western Europe must persist. It's their responsibility. Now this is obviously, for us, a very strange argument. Right? It runs antithetical to our belief of human equality, our notions of liberty. But this is very much the rationale of the moment. The white man's burden is about changing around in their minds.